Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to talk about how to dial in your compression for bass guitar. So here's the song I'm going to be demonstrating with. And then here's the bass soloed out. Okay, so the approach is pretty simple overall, but there are a few nuances, a few small touches that can really help you get a solid bass tone in the mix. So I'm going to explain every step of my usual workflow here. And the first nuance is, what is the tone itself that you recorded or that you're creating in the DAW? You know, are you recording just straight up DI and mixing that, or is there some distortion or an amp tone? Now, that is probably going to be the case 80+% of the time, right? You're going to have some sort of amp tone in there, and that really is the first stage of compression via distortion. So in this bass tone, you can see I've got two tracks here. They're actually the exact same. This is just a straight up DI track here. And let me just bypass some of the compression that's happening here. Okay, so here's the DI sound. And what I've done is I've duplicated it. So the first track here is kind of a cleaner amp tone. It's got a bit of grit, and then I add in this dark glass distorted tone and blend those together. So that's the starting point of my bass tone. And if you look at the waveforms here, you can see that there are a lot of spikes, you know, like where he's picked a little bit harder here, and we've got a big spike here, and just the dynamics are, you know, pretty big here depending on where he's playing, right? This is on the higher string, and he goes to the lower string. It's just louder. There's more energy down there. So we've definitely got to control and even out those dynamics there. But if you look at this track here, this is just a bounce that I did of these two tracks. So these two bass tones blended together with no other processing. So right away, you can see that before I've done any additional compression or anything else, we've already smoothed out a lot of those dynamic swings, and we've got rid of kind of those transient spikes in the bass track. So that's really step one, is what is the tone itself? And of course, I'm always working on rock and heavier music on this channel, but even on a more cleaner pop song, this would be the case. You're usually going to have some sort of amp sound on the bass, and that's going to smooth out a lot of the dynamics right off the top. So that's the first thing off the top, but now we can get into the actual compression that I do in the mix. And by the way, all the settings that I'm going to mention here, these are all outlined on my mixing cheat sheet. You can download it for free. There's a link below, or you can go to mixcheatsheet.com, and it's just got all the go-to starting points for EQ and compression, not only for bass guitar, but a bunch of other tracks that you commonly have in the mix. So go and grab the mixing cheat sheet. Don't worry about trying to remember this or take notes. So the first step of compression that I do on a bass track is with the 1176. And this is just to further level out and even out and, in a sense, beef up the bass tone. So let's check this out. We've got an 1176, which is a really popular classic compressor to use on bass. We've got a fairly fast attack, not the fastest. We want to let a little bit of transient through so that we get kind of a strong attack on it. It feels like it's, you know, being played hard. We don't want to totally clamp it down on that, but fairly fast so that the level stays fairly even. And then the release is actually somewhat slower. You can see the needle takes a little bit of time to get back up. And again, that's going to help the level stay consistent, right? So that it's not like on a big strum, you know, the compressor kicks in and then immediately goes back. You know, you're going to get a lot more kind of compression artifacts if you do it that way. Whereas if you have a slower release, the compressor is going to kind of stay compressed, for lack of a better term, and it's going to keep the signal more at a consistent level. So let me A/B it for you. All right, I'm going to play this a couple times because it's fairly subtle, and you can see like this is the waveform that we're basically working with at this point, right? So it's not like it needs to be evened out a ton, but listen again and just hear how there's just a subtle increase of energy, especially in the low end. You can hear that it just gets a little more consistent, a little fuller, a little beefier, because we're just taking all of these kind of low level dips. You can see how the level dips a bit here, and then it gets louder there, and then it dips here and gets louder there. That is just coming up a little bit. It's getting even more consistent. And I'm not afraid to do a fair bit of gain reduction here, and it sounds fairly transparent still, but that's just because, again, I want my bass track to really be almost a solid block. Like in a modern rock mix or heavy track or even pop, you don't want the bass energy to be like all over the place, coming in and out and up and down. You want it to be very subtle, and then you can manipulate that with automation. You can still have the low end increase or decrease, but it's really good to have that nice and controlled in the mix. And I'll give you a little visual demo of what's happening here, not because it matters what stuff looks like, but just so you can visualize what I'm talking about here. So let's go ahead and process this track. So this is what the first stage of compression looks like, right? And again, it's just a subtle evening out. So here it was before, here it is after processing, more of a solid block. And there's one other thing that this compressor is doing, and it's maintaining and adding energy to the pick attack. So if we go to a section here where there's some cuts, let's bypass. So again, it's subtle. You can hear a couple things there, but what I wanted to point out is that the initial pick attack, we're not clamping fully down on that. Like I said, we want to have a tiny bit of that front end transient, so it does sound like he's still digging in on those strings. It kind of emphasizes the scrape and the attack of the pick, which I really like there. And just in case you don't have an 1176 plugin, I definitely recommend that you get something like this. It's just a great tool to have in your tool bag, but I'll show you how to dial this in even with a stock compressor here. So again, you want a fairly fast attack, but you want to let a little through. So try about 7 to 10 milliseconds, slower release, 600, 700 milliseconds, 4:1 ratio. Check this out. And if I A/B, here's the 1176. Here's the stock compressor. So just like that, you can get very similar results. So that's the main compressor for the bass. And there are some nuances and different cases that might come up where I would change this approach a little bit. I'm going to talk about that later in the video. But for now, let's move on to the second step of compression that I do on the bass, which is specifically just for the low end. So let's pull up this low control plugin from Black Salt Audio. Yes, disclaimer, I do own Black Salt Audio, and I helped develop this plugin specifically to do what I want to do here. So what this plugin is doing is it's taking all of the frequencies below a certain point. So in this case, I've got it set to 80. That's where the crossover is. So there are going to be some frequencies above that too, but basically everything around 80 and below, we're going to compress those independently of the rest of the signal. So check this out. So in this case, you can see the gain reduction meter. We're not totally slamming it. The goal is to just even out even more those low frequencies, specifically those sub frequencies that are going to be kind of the boom and the rumble and a lot of power on big speaker systems. I want those to be extra smooth, extra controlled, and extra consistent. We don't want, the low end energy to kind of disappear as he's higher up on the neck or on higher strings, and then be totally crazy on the lower notes and the lower string. This really helps it all stay super consistent. And the thing I love about it is that it takes those low frequencies, that whole low octave, if you will, compresses it, controls it, and then puts it on its own fader, essentially. So you can control exactly how much of that sub you want in the mix. And we do that just by increasing or decreasing the low gain. Now, in this case, there was a lot of low end energy already in the bass tone, so I just left it at 0. I actually had to reduce it with the compression here. But if there wasn't enough, you could compress it and then turn it up. So check this out. So you really have full control over those low sub frequencies. And this is something that I always do in my mixes. Really helps every note be consistent. The bass gets even more solid. And this is something that you could do with the standard multi-band compressor. Just isolate specifically the low band. Usually the frequency you want to aim at is just kind of somewhere 100 and below. But this low control plugin certainly makes it a lot faster and easier. And this plugin is after the 1176 on purpose because I'm trying to even out the overall bass tone. And then I want to have, full control over those low frequencies after that. Because if I had this before the 1176, well, then the compressor is going to behave differently depending on how much sub I add. So if I decide, midway through the mix that, oh, I actually need a lot more sub from this bass, and I crank it up here, and then it goes into the 1176, well, now all of a sudden the 1176 is going to be compressing a lot more. We're going to lose some of the high-end attack and stuff because it's just working so hard on those low frequencies. So that's why I put this plugin after the 1176. However, on some rare cases, I've actually had 2 instances of this low control plugin, and that's when the low end and the low mids of the bass are like super inconsistent, maybe bad performance, maybe just bad tone or bad bass guitar that they recorded with. In that case, I'll try putting this low control plugin on first, and I'll set this to like 250 hertz so that really it's getting all the lows and the low mids and compressing those first, evening those out so that I have a good starting point to do the main compression with. So I'll put that first, even it out, and then put the 1176 on, do the normal compression like you see. So then I've got kind of a standard, relatively even bass tone, and then I'll throw a second instance of low control on where I'm specifically dealing with the subs. And that's essentially it. I'll play one more part here so you can hear it in the context of the mix.
Stumble out of bed 'cause I'm still drunk. A bad luck. Left my keys inside a payphone. I even got home. Popping all these pills just to feel safe.
And in 95% of what I mix in the rock and heavy music sphere, this approach stays exactly the same. Like you'll see this in mix after mix that I do. Now, the odd time, you might need a slightly different approach. I already explained one of those scenarios with the extra multiband compression, but let's say we have like a finger-picked bass where the dynamics are not very controlled, or you have a slap bass where you have a bunch of kind of spikes and transients in the bass track. Well, in that case, I might dial in the compressor with the same starting points, but I might speed up the attack a bit just to clamp down on those spikes a little more. And I can demonstrate even what that would do here just visually. So if we look at this DI track here, let's pretend this was a slap bass or a finger-picked bass, and we've got these big spikes and transients. Well, if we start with the same compression settings here, that alone is going to even it out a lot, right? You can see the big difference there. It does turn down those spikes a bit, and it starts to control it. But if we just speed up the attack a little bit, or let's put it the fastest it can go, we can control those even more, right? So even with a standard 1176 style compressor here, with the fastest attack, you really can clamp down on any extra spiky dynamics in your bass track. Another different case would be if you're mixing kind of a mellower track or something where the bass is just holding these long sustained notes. Sometimes you need to play with the release time a little bit so that he plays the note, and then as it's ringing out, the compressor is gradually going to release, right? And you want to time the release so that it's basically smoothly letting go of that signal and returning it to 0 or close to 0 right as they're about to pick the next note. Because if you have it too fast and they're holding these notes, and especially if there's a big transient on the pick attack or the finger attack, well, then it's going to clamp down and it's going to let go, and you're going to get kind of like a like pumping effect of the low end of the bass. And you don't want that. So you want to play with the release time so that it's fairly transparent on how it releases and you have a nice smooth level for every note. But those are pretty rare edge cases. If you're a rock mixer like me or even a pop mixer, just try this approach. It's going to work 95% of the time. So links to the plugins I'm using are down below. And like I said, you can grab my mixing cheat sheet for free. There's a link down there too. And I am planning some more Magic compression videos here like this one. So let me know what instruments you want to see next in the comments, and check out my Magic compression settings for kick and snare right here.